Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm Tobias Burgers. I'm a project assistant professor at the CCRC, the Cyber Civilization Research Center, part of the KGRI Institute of Keio University. I'm here to give a brief introduction to the research I do in collaboration with my collaborator, Professor Farber, who is here as well. Thank you for that. We have a wide range of research at the CCRC, and much of our focus, at least the team that we do, is on cybersecurity. And we've been thinking long and hard over the course of this summer about how we can make a positive impact towards research on cybersecurity on a global and regional level. Once we were analyzing what's going on within the cyber domain and the cybersecurity domain, we came to the conclusion that we observed a few developments that were both worrisome and at the same time give us room and encouragement to conduct further research. Among them is the first development that we noticed that within the domain of cyber operations, there seems to be a tendency to move away from initial older cyber operations that were offensive in nature, but albeit focused on information gathering. This is the more, how do we say, classical approach to cyber operations in which the aim was to be to gather information and to steal information. This is gradually over the course of the last few years, we've seen what we would call something like first cracks on the digital horizon, and it's the rise of disruptive and destructive cyber operations. This is an escalatory pattern we established, and it's moving towards compromising infrastructure and actually attacking targets with the aim to disrupt or destruct. Examples would be data systems, data networks, and so on, and like physical infrastructure. This has what we think the impact of such cyber operations is something we poorly understand as it's given now, which gives us incentive to conduct further research. We see this as this escalatory pattern, which I just mentioned. It's a dual track approach. First, we see that within the digital domain, there seems to be an incentive among certain actors, both state and non-state, to use offensive cyber operations, as I mentioned, to alter or destroy valuable data within the digital domain. Secondly, and the more worrisome escalatory pattern would be the transition from digital to physical. As I mentioned earlier, for a long time, cyber operations were primarily confined to conducting operations in the digital domain with aims and goals in the digital domain as well. What we're seeing now in the last few years is that cyber is basically becoming a mean or a way to establish and achieve goals in the physical domains. Shortly summarized, it's basically using cyber means to cause physical damage. This is a relatively novel development. This is a development that's been taking off in the last few years, and this is a development that's the most worrisome to us. There's a few examples of these kind of developments. I think the most prominent one would be Iran in the Stuxnet, in which the United States used the virus possibly in collaboration with Israel, to destroy a physical target. There are a number of other targets along the way that exemplify this. There's the South Korea cyber attack against financial systems and broadcasting networks. There's the Saudi Arabian Aramco cyber attack in 2012 and 2017 when it was repeated. The North Korean missile cyber attacks in which the Obama government used cyber means to interfere with missile launches from the North Korean missile program. And there's a few other more. Most outstanding is the Ukrainian cyber attack as well. But once we started analyzing these kind of developments, we were worried about how can we understand the dynamics of such conflict dynamics. And me and Professor Farber thought about this long and hard over the summer. And we came to the conclusion in many, many cases when it comes to the developments of this and the likelihood that such a conflict could escalate, it's up to the decision makers to decide will they escalate or not. The problem there is that given the case studies we have, there are not many. As I noticed, there's a few of them. They're increasingly more and more and more, but the information is limited and the number of case studies is limited too. That brought us up to a problem like how can we study and how can we prepare for such events in the future if we need to learn and understand this to reduce the risks of such escalatory patterns. That brought us to the simple idea that sometimes to understand the future, one has to look at the past. And here we came to the conclusion that the introduction of nuclear weapons, particularly in the late 40s and the early 1950s, produced an interesting case study for us how to look forward, not particularly in terminology of case studies, of course, Both technologies are significantly different, but more in the sense of how can we deal with the problem of having a knowledge gap about this. Here, the history of nuclear weapons industry and the introduction into the international security domain proved a valuable point of research for us. It turns out that looking back at the future, we realized that having surveys, scenarios, and Delphi method seems the most appropriate research way forward for us to understanding like the knowledge gaps within these escalatory patterns of cyber conflict. So we sat together, had a few long evenings and good dinners, and came to the conclusion that the best way initial forward for us was to start a project running as a large-scale survey. Initially, the idea was to launch it within Japan. However, given the boundaries or the non-boundaries of cyber conflict, the lack of clear actors, and in general the fuzziness of like attribution, we thought it would be not a bad thing to start on a global level in a more broader general fictive scenario. So later on in September, it was about 6 weeks ago, we launched our initial survey. The initial survey started off very simple. It's a rudimentary survey that should be seen as a starting point for like a larger point of research for us. The survey basically consisted of 3 scenarios in which a fictive nation was under attack, under a cyber attack by another actor. It was not entirely defined who this actor was. There seems to be at least some of the constraints we put into the survey and to the scenarios was that the actor was presumably a nation state or a non-station actor supported by a nation state. And what we did in the scenarios is we made the differentiation or the variables in the scenarios were primarily about the differences in the impact of attacks. So the first scenario brought up the idea of like, okay, we have an attack with a minimum impact on the physical infrastructure or the digital infrastructure. It's not entirely sure, but how would, for example, policymakers react to this? And here comes in the dynamics of escalatory cyber conflict, because one of the problems we established within the scenarios and in general is that the dynamic favors offensive actors. So if we understand that, and if these dynamics seem to favor the offensive actors, this brings up the question, what can the defensive actor do to ensure that he would have an appropriate response, but not always are likely to escalate the conflict? Furthermore, what we established with these scenarios as well, while running them and developing them, is that often actors are sensitive to the disclosure of being attacked and the impact of these attacks. Like some of the examples I mentioned, what was interesting to notice there is that in many, many cases, those under attack were not very keen to submit to knowing these attacks and that these attacks actually took place. This brings us to the first scenario, what I just mentioned. It was as a minimum impact, and then we noticed that the impact is minimum, it's a short-term disruptive impact, is less than a day, it's damage that can be reserved in a relatively short term. Examples could be a large-scale ransomware attack against medical IT infrastructures. This was followed by a second scenario, simply basically called the medium scenario. Here the impact is, of course, significantly different than the minimal scenario. We're talking about long-term disruptive impact, something between 2 to 6 days. The damage in such cases, let it be either digital or physical, can be repaired, but it needs to be mentioned that this would take considerable time. And this is what sets apart the medium scenario clearly from the minimum scenario, because in the minimum scenario, we're looking at damage that if the decision is made to reverse the damage, this can be done in less than a day. In the medium scenario, even if the decision is made, this would take considerable time. Examples of such could be an attack against the regional electricity infrastructure, paralyzing the grid and power supply for consecutive days. This is followed by what we consider the more extreme scenario, where the attack would be against critical infrastructure of maximum or utmost importance. The impact here, of course, has to be much more destructive. We're not talking about disruptions anymore, but about clear destructions. The noticeable impact in such scenarios is easily over 7 days. It's basically damage that's irreversible and that cannot be changed and basically has to be replaced. Think of something, example-wise, an attack against a physical target with the aim of widespread destructive damage in a physical domain, power plants, chemical plants, oil processing plants. This is a number of examples that came up by actually studying cases. We run the initial survey, which is seen as one of the first surveys in a longer process. And what was quite interesting and quite surprising to our, I would say, stunningness, so to say, is that we thought that within all the scenarios, there would be much more likeliness within actors to at least develop an appropriate response or even escalate. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, there seems to be the offensive actors are actually benefiting from cyber conflicts, so one would expect that at least defensive actors to some extent might have a tendency to draw a clear red line in saying, okay, this is the maximum impact and damage you can do to me, both in the cyber and the physical domain, because we would like to set a red line and make sure that there is no escalatory pattern. However, in the first scenario, which was interesting, is that in many cases, most of the respondents, well over 40%, said they would like to respond maximum. We basically give the respondents 4 options to reply, either by cyber means, by political means, economic means, or military means. The survey will be public in a few months once we have another few run and once it will be published. And it turns out that in the first minimum scenario, well over 40% of the people or the respondents said, okay, we would like to respond by cyber means, but no means any of the choices that we give them in the domain of cyber responses to an attack was escalatory. At best, it was appropriate. And even the majority of the respondents in the first the minimum scenario basically said, okay, we would think an appropriate response to such kind of an attack would be ensuring that any further attack will not take place. There was no desire in any way among any of the actors to even launch a broad military response. There was no desire to do economic sanctions or even have a strong political message. It basically seems to reaffirm that when we're talking about cyber attacks within the domain of minimum impact, it seems to evolve into a shadowy, something of a cyber conflict that is not very visible and that remains very hidden, primarily for the purpose of making sure that there's no escalation. It's a bit what I referred earlier to. It seems to reinforce the idea of having this state of non-war and un-peace, somewhere a gray zone in between. Moving forward towards the second scenario, this was quite interesting as well. This is where we're talking about something with a medium impact, something that is visible clearly to the public and which is easy to observe. It's definitely difficult to hide, and it has an impact that measures among multiple days. So you would expect that it would dominate the news cycles and so on. Even there, when we ask our experts and respondents, it became interesting to notice that, because we expected that in such a scenario, there would be a clear incentive to draw a red line by those under attack and say, okay, this has a significant impact on the way our society operates. But even there, it turns out that the most favorable counter response or countermeasure was an economic, responding by economic means. This was interesting in the sense that even there, when it was about economic means, only 1/3 of the actors actually decided that large-scale economic sanctions was something that was the right way forward. Rather, the majority still seemed to think that limited economic sanctions, let's say against a possible economic, leadership or political leadership of a nation, was the best appropriate response. This brings up an interesting idea, because one would expect that in these kind of options, there would be a much stronger political response or a military response. Such seems not the case. Even the second response, or the second most favored response to this kind of attack, is against one's striking back by cyber means. In this way, there's a clear linkage between the first scenario and the second scenario, because here too, the most favored opinion within the second response of the cyber domain seems to be striking back against the target without making sure that it would not escalate. Even a large-scale option, what we included was an escalatory cyber offensive, was only favored by less than 16% of the people, which is quite remarkable and illustrates the tendencies in both scenarios to make sure that there's no escalation. This brings us to the most, for us, the most dynamic and most interesting scenario, which is of course the large-scale scenario. And this is something of a significant attack. This is something that would have an impact of months and if not so longer. Here we would expect that the responses would be the strongest and that people would overwhelmingly tend to vote for pursuing the military option. Fortunately, or unfortunately, it depends how one looks at it, but it became clear that indeed the military was the most favored response by well over 50% of the respondents saying a military approach was most favored. Even there, a quarter of the people still voted for a political response and a non-military response. What's important to notice there, and what we found quite interesting, that even within the domain of military responses, it turns out that basically we included 4 military responses, which range from like non-escalatory increased military readiness, covert military operations, limited overt military operations, and extensive military campaigns against a nation. One would expect, given the impact of an attack like such, and given the history of prior conflicts, which were definitely started for less, that most actors would actually seek to start an extensive military campaign. Turns out that only 25% of the actors thought this was the most appropriate approach to making sure that as a response. The most favored one, with well over 50%, was limited military responses. So here we see a cyber attack that has a significant impact on a society, is destructive, easily can cause casualties, but among experts at least, there still seems to be the idea that even in this scenario, we have to think about that the maximum we could do is a limited military response in order to not escalate. This brought us up that now in our initial research, when we try to understand decision making, it turns out that despite having an escalatory pattern that favors offensive actors, at least on the defensive side, actors still seems to favor not escalatory patterns. This is something interesting, and this is something that brought us up for research in the next half a year to the next year and a half, about how can we understand this further, because we see that to some extent, if experts seem to think that could there be a difference as well, what the public perception is, because of course experts have a clear understanding about escalatory patterns, the public might not have such. This is one of the ways we want to go forward in our project as well. We want to understand if there's regional differences between how experts would reply. Like I said, this is a general survey where most of the respondents seems to come from either East Asia, the US, Canada, or Europe. So one would expect that maybe having cultural differences and different security dynamics would impact this as well. So we're going to follow this up with running the service within Japan, Taiwan, and the US in the coming months to see if there's any results that would differ from the general result and within. After this, we want to engage on a larger scale survey and try to understand the public perception and how that would change. What we need to think as well is if this research, of course, is something that's not supposed to be only solely for academics. Given the impact of cyber operations, given the importance of cyber technology and cyberspace in contemporary society, I think, or we think it's viable that we share this kind of research more with the public. So one of our further goals as well is to enhance our research, to increase our research output and the visibility for most of our research to inform the general public. And this goes back to the idea of the Silent Cyber Spring. The Silent Spring project refers to a book in the early 60s that basically raised the public awareness about environmental problems. One can wonder to which extent it was effective, because 70 years later, or 60 years later, nearly 60 years later, we're still facing an array of environmental problems, but at least the book succeeded in putting the issue of environmental security issues clearly on the map and within the mind of the people within society. The idea for us within the Cyber Silent Spring, of course, at least on a more moderate level, is at least to raise the awareness among the general public about the possible impact of cybersecurity, the possible impact as well of offensive cyber operations, and how we can prepare a general public to react to this. Thank you.